On a humid March morning in 1853, inside a Louisiana parish courthouse, a human life was sold for 12 cents, the price of a loaf of bread. Not $12, not 1,200. 12 copper coins clinked against a wooden table, and with that sound, a woman lost her freedom forever. She was young, pregnant, and unnamed in the official records. The men who witnessed the sale, 7 of them, signed their names proudly on the deed. Every one of them ensured the law would bless what morality should have cursed. Yet the woman they sold vanished from history almost as soon as the ink dried. No registry, no burial, no trace. For over 40 years, no one spoke of her. Then, during courthouse renovations in 1897, workers discovered a sealed wall. Inside was the original receipt, creased, yellowed, and still stained with age. But on the back, written in a trembling hand, was something no historian expected to find. Whatever those words said, they were hidden again, buried deeper than before, locked away by the descendants of the men who had signed the sale. They wanted the truth to rot in silence. Tonight, that silence ends. We're opening the wall they built, not of brick and mortar, but of shame and power. We're uncovering what happened to the woman who was sold for 12 cents, and why the men who condemned her feared her story more than her existence. Before we continue, take a moment to support the work that keeps forgotten voices alive. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, stories they tried to erase, deserve to be heard again. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Let's see how far these buried histories can travel. Before we dive deeper into what happened that morning in Louisiana, pause for a moment and really think about this. A woman, pregnant, alive, terrified, was sold for less than the cost of a newspaper. Somewhere, a gavel struck wood, and a crowd accepted that judgment as normal. That is the world we're about to step into. If you've been following Grave of the Shadows, you already know this channel doesn't chase fiction, it resurrects truth. The kind that was deliberately buried under dust, denial, and polite silence. What you're hearing now isn't legend or exaggeration. It's a documented transaction witnessed by men who believed they were instruments of civilization. But what if the law they upheld was itself the instrument of horror? What if legality and evil walked hand in hand? Stories like this are more than history lessons. They're mirrors reflecting what happens when conscience bows to comfort, when people choose obedience over humanity. And as we uncover what happened in that courthouse, you'll see that every signature on that receipt was a confession written in ink instead of blood. So, before we continue, help us keep these lost stories breathing. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows right now, and tap that bell icon so you don't miss the next revelation. Every click, every share, every comment is a blow against the silence that history tried to preserve. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. Are you in the Deep South, the Midwest, across the ocean? These voices, once confined to a single courthouse in Louisiana, deserve to echo across borders, through screens, into hearts that still believe justice can speak, even from the grave. To understand what happened that morning, you have to see the world that allowed it. Louisiana in 1853 wasn't just a state, it was an empire built on soil and silence. The air along the Mississippi River carried the scent of cane, sweat, and ash. Spanish moss dripped from ancient oaks like mourning veils. Every breeze whispered the same truth. Wealth here didn't come from land, it came from lives. St. Helena Parish sat in that green corridor between Baton Rouge and the Mississippi border, where sugar and cotton meant power, and power meant law. Its people were governed by a simple hierarchy: white men who owned, white men who enforced, and everyone else who obeyed. The courthouse stood in the center of Greensburg, a modest town with whitewashed buildings arranged around a square that smelled of tobacco and horses. On Saturdays, those courthouse steps became a marketplace of human existence. Furniture, tools, livestock, and people were auctioned with equal detachment. To the locals, this wasn't cruelty. It was commerce. Each transaction was blessed by paperwork, notarized by the same steady hands that held Bibles on Sunday. The law didn't just permit the sale of a person, it perfected it, ensuring that suffering could be measured, priced, and taxed. The auctioneers prided themselves on efficiency. They spoke of inventory and yield. Their voices rose above the cries of the riverboats docking nearby, blending the sound of trade with the language of possession. Children learned early that the word property didn't always mean wood or land, and yet beneath this rigid order, fear simmered. Plantation owners feared rebellion, judges feared disruption, and the enslaved feared everything but God. Even the church bells seemed complicit. They marked the hours when souls were bought and sold. In 1853, St. Helena Parish was ruled by three men whose power defined its moral climate. Their names appeared on every deed, every conviction, every body transferred from one master to another. To them, justice wasn't a principle, it was property management. Judge Amos Crenshaw was the oldest, 62. A man whose gray beard and black coat gave him the appearance of wisdom he didn't possess. For 4 decades he'd sat behind a walnut bench, interpreting laws written to protect ownership above all else. He liked to say, "Order is the highest mercy." What he meant was obedience. Then there was Duncan Fairholme, the plantation lord of Belmont. 4,000 acres of river-fed soil and nearly 50 enslaved people to work it. Educated in Charleston, fluent in French and fluent too in cruelty, he saw himself as a philosopher of civilization. Discipline, he told visitors, is the currency of progress. To his mind, compassion was weakness that threatened the economy. And finally, Nathaniel Pute, the parish recorder and tax assessor. A younger man, ambitious, and hungry to climb into the circle of the powerful. He was the sort who believed signatures could make him immortal. He documented every birth, every sale, every loss, his quill scratching like a metronome for human suffering. Together, these men created a world where paperwork turned violence into virtue. A woman could be sold, beaten, or erased entirely, and still it was called justice. The courthouse itself was the heart of this machinery. A 2-story brick building with peeling white columns and a clock that hadn't worked in years. Time didn't move here, it repeated. Each sale, each cry, each rustling of parchment was a refrain in the same terrible song. It was in this place, under this system, that a young woman's fate would be sealed for 12 cents. The crowd that gathered that day didn't see a human being. They saw an opportunity, a test of how cheaply power could prove its dominance. The men on the steps were not monsters born. They were citizens made. They were proof that evil, when sanctioned by law, can look ordinary. So, when we speak of the woman sold for the price of bread, we're not only telling her story. We're telling the story of a nation that measured its virtue by its obedience, that baptized its sins in legal ink, and called it civilization. In every dark system, there are men who make the cruelty possible, men who sign their names to another person's suffering and call it duty. In St. Helena Parish, 1853, those men formed an unholy trinity. Judge Amos Crenshaw, Duncan Fairholme, and Silas Guthrie. Together, they controlled the rhythm of law, land, and life itself. Judge Crenshaw presided over the district court from a high-back chair polished by 40 years of arrogance. His face was a map of creases carved by habit, not empathy. He believed the law to be a divine instrument, immune to moral question. When he signed orders that condemned families to separation, he told himself he was preserving order. He measured justice in property value, not pain. Every stroke of his pen declared that the system worked, and if people suffered, that was proof of its necessity. Duncan Fairholme, on the other hand, did not hide behind pretense. He owned Belmont Plantation, for 1,000 acres that glistened with cotton and cruelty. To his peers, he was a man of refinement. Educated in Charleston, well-read, fluent in French. But to those who lived under his rule, he was an architect of despair. He enforced obedience not through reason but through humiliation. His belief was simple. Breaking a person's spirit was the truest form of control. He saw compassion as a flaw, mercy as weakness, and dignity as rebellion. And then there was Silas Guthrie, the overseer, the man Duncan trusted to turn his philosophy into flesh. Silas wasn't wealthy, but he wielded terror like a weapon. He was the type of man who whistled while he punished others, the type whose cruelty didn't come from ideology but from appetite. Under his supervision, Bellomont's enslaved population learned silence as a form of survival. These three men, Crenshaw the Law, Duncan the Master, and Guthrie the Hand, were bound not by friendship but by function. Each needed the others to maintain his illusion of righteousness. Crenshaw gave legality to Duncan's cruelty. Duncan gave purpose to Guthrie's violence. Guthrie gave Crenshaw evidence that the system was working. It was a circle that fed on human lives and called itself civilization. On Sunday mornings, they occupied the front pews of the same church. The preacher spoke of heaven's justice, of sin and salvation. Crenshaw bowed his head solemnly, Duncan nodded thoughtfully, and Guthrie sat with the posture of a man who didn't understand the words but liked the sound of power behind them. The congregation saw three pillars of their community: law, wealth, and order, sitting side by side beneath the cross. No one questioned what they did between Monday and Saturday. To outsiders, St. Helena seemed peaceful. Fields bloomed, trade thrived, courthouse records were orderly and precise. But that neatness was built on omission, on names missing from ledgers, on stories that ended abruptly, on 1,000 erased lives that no document could resurrect. Behind closed doors, these men whispered about debts, about land disputes, about the problem of the Fairholme family's younger son, William. William's ideas about freedom had begun to disturb the balance. He had spoken to his brother Duncan about manumission, about the notion that ownership of human beings was both sinful and unsustainable. Duncan dismissed him with laughter. Crenshaw warned him to be careful. Guthrie simply waited for orders. In this delicate triangle of power, William's conscience was a contagion, and Clara, the woman carrying his child, would become the means to cure it. Her body, her existence, was about to be transformed into a message written for all who dared to defy the hierarchy. Duncan would make an example not only of her but of love itself. And so, beneath the surface of this orderly parish, a cruel plan began to take shape. A plan that would expose how easily justice could be twisted, how effortlessly humanity could be traded, and how a single act of defiance could threaten the foundation of an entire world. What followed would be remembered not for its legality, but for its evil precision. Her name was Clara, though even that survives only in fragments, scribbled in an old inventory list found decades later in a courthouse attic. To the men who owned her, names were unnecessary. To them, identity began and ended with a price tag. Yet to those who worked beside her in the fields and kitchens of Bellomont Plantation, Clara was more than property. She was grace in motion, a mind that refused to stay silent. Clara was born in Virginia around 1830, on a small tobacco plantation owned by a man who treated human lives like ledger entries. Her mother, Liza, taught her how to read before Clara turned 10, a crime punishable by flogging. They read scripture from scraps of paper hidden inside cornmeal sacks, whispered letters under candlelight. When traders came through Richmond one August morning, Clara was 15. Her mother and two younger siblings were sold in separate lots. Clara remembered her mother's voice breaking on her name as the auctioneer's hammer struck wood. It was the last sound she ever heard from her family. The man who purchased her was Edmund Fairholme, father of Duncan. He brought her to Louisiana with the rest of his new property. Bellomont was vast, its beauty deceptive. Rows of cotton glistened like snow, but beneath that white shimmer lay years of blood and brokenness. Clara worked in the main house because she could read, write, and calculate figures, skills her owners found useful but unsettling. Her quiet intelligence drew attention, especially from Duncan's younger brother, William Fairholme. William was different, or at least he tried to be. He was 28, educated, restless, and painfully aware of the hypocrisy that surrounded him. He read abolitionist pamphlets smuggled from New Orleans, though he hid them between volumes of scripture. He spoke to Clara like a person, not a possession. What began as conversation during meal deliveries soon became something forbidden, a bond both dangerous and undeniable. When Clara realized she was pregnant in late 1852, she said nothing at first, but silence couldn't hide truth for long. Duncan's wife, Margaret, noticed before anyone else the way Clara moved slower, the subtle curve beneath her apron. And Duncan, ever observant, saw his brother's guilt in every glance. To Duncan, the revelation was not simply scandalous. It was treason. His brother had defiled the sacred hierarchy of ownership. Love, in his view, was the ultimate disobedience. He called William into his study one evening and listened without emotion as William pleaded to purchase Clara's freedom. Duncan's response was ice cold. "You cannot buy what never belonged to you." In that moment, Duncan made a decision that would echo for generations. He would not sell Clara to a traitor who might carry her far away. No, he wanted punishment, spectacle, control. He would make his brother watch as the woman he loved became a public transaction, stripped of dignity and sold for a sum so insulting it would wound the very idea of love. From that cruelty, a single number emerged: 12 cents. In the world of 1853 Louisiana, a healthy enslaved woman of childbearing age could sell for nearly $1,000. By setting her price at 12 cents, Duncan wasn't devaluing her, he was desecrating her. He wanted everyone in St. Helena Parish to see how cheaply he could ruin two lives. That decision didn't just condemn Clara, it exposed the moral void of the world she lived in. Every man who heard that announcement and stayed silent became part of the crime. In the weeks leading up to the auction, Clara remained calm, almost eerily so. The women in the quarters braided her hair each night and whispered prayers that mixed hope with resignation. An elderly cook named Bethy, who had survived 5 decades of bondage, pressed a small bundle into Clara's hand. A cloth-wrapped knife, no longer than her palm. "Hide this," Bethy whispered. "If they mean to break you, don't let them finish the job." Clara didn't answer. She simply nodded and sewed the blade into the hem of her dress. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from resolve. Whatever happened on those courthouse steps, she would face it standing. What she couldn't know was that her sale would draw the attention of someone unexpected. A man who had seen her once before, 8 years earlier, in another auction house, on another terrible day. A man who would pay more than 12 cents, not to own her, but to challenge the system that had claimed her life. His name was Isaiah Mercer, and he was about to rewrite the ending Duncan Fairholme had planned. By February of 1853, Duncan Fairholme's vengeance had matured into a strategy so precise it bordered on artistry. He didn't simply want Clara removed. He wanted her existence to humiliate everyone it touched. He wanted William's love to become a curse whispered behind closed doors, a warning to anyone who dared mistake compassion for equality. The plan began with a letter, hand-delivered to Judge Crenshaw, informing him of an upcoming liquidation of assets at Bellamont. The document listed livestock, tools, and a single enslaved woman, of uncertain health and limited utility. Duncan was careful with his phrasing. Every word was chosen to disguise his obsession as procedure. Crenshaw, whose moral compass pointed only toward the law, nodded approvingly. 12 cents, he murmured when Duncan proposed the price. An unusual number. Symbolic, Duncan replied. The value of bread, the price of sustenance. The judge didn't ask further. Legality, after all, required no justification beyond ink. Meanwhile, William moved through the days like a man drowning in air. He begged Duncan privately to stop the sale, even offered his inheritance and land. Duncan's answer never changed. "There are rules, brother. Break one, and the whole order collapses." William's desperation soon led him to Crenshaw himself. Late one night, under the flicker of a dying oil lamp, he offered the judge every dollar he possessed to void the auction. Crenshaw listened, patient and unmoved. "Did your brother sign the deed?" he asked. "Yes," William whispered. "Then it stands," Crenshaw said. "The law does not bend for grief." It was a truth more poisonous than any lie. Duncan's cruelty thrived on ceremony. He scheduled the sale for March 14th, a Saturday, when the courthouse square would be full of traders and townsfolk. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the humiliation public, irreversible. In the days before the auction, he instructed Nathaniel Pute, the parish recorder, to prepare a separate document voiding any future challenge to the sale. Pute, eager to please, complied without question. To him, paperwork was safety. Only one man objected, Silas Guthrie. Even he, seasoned in brutality, found the situation strange. "A woman for 12 cents, he muttered. "The crowd'll think she's diseased." "Exactly," Duncan said. "No one will touch her. You'll bid alone." Guthrie frowned. "And then you take her home," Duncan replied, "and do what's necessary to ensure she forgets what she was." Guthrie nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken order. Duncan trusted him to do what cruelty required without witnesses. But fate, or perhaps guilt, has a way of slipping into even the tightest designs. The night before the auction, William vanished. He left no note, no trace of his destination. Some said he'd fled north to join abolitionists. Others claimed he'd taken his own life in the river that bordered Bellamont's fields. Duncan said nothing, though those close to him recalled that he appeared lighter the next morning, as though the disappearance had confirmed the righteousness of his plan. At dawn on the 14th, the square filled with murmurs. Rain clouds hung low over the courthouse roof. Men leaned on canes. Women whispered behind gloves. Children stared with the wide eyes of those too young to understand and too old to forget. Duncan stood near the steps, coat buttoned high, expression calm. Judge Crenshaw took his seat beside the clerk's table. Pute prepared his papers. And somewhere in the crowd, Silas Guthrie waited, hat pulled low, silver coins ready in his palm. For Duncan, this was more than revenge. It was theater. He imagined the moment Clara's name was called, the gasp when her price was announced, the pitying laughter that would follow. In that laughter, William's rebellion would die. But what Duncan did not imagine, what he could not anticipate, was that someone else was already in Greensburg, someone whose arrival would unravel his perfect cruelty. A stranger carrying his own ledger of sins, determined to buy not property, but redemption. When the gavel finally fell and Clara was led onto the courthouse steps, Duncan Fairholme believed he controlled every outcome. He did not yet know that his empire of order was standing on sand. March 14, 1853. The courthouse square of St. Helena Parish smelled of wet dust and iron. Rain from the night before had turned the ground into a patchwork of mud and reflection. By 10 o'clock, a crowd had gathered. Planters in waistcoats, merchants with silver-tipped canes, a handful of curious townsfolk come to watch the week's entertainment. Auctions were routine here. Morality rarely was. At the top of the courthouse steps, Nathaniel Pute adjusted his spectacles and unrolled the deed of sale. His voice was steady, bureaucratic, stripped of all feeling. "Lot number 14, he announced. "Female, age approximately 23 years, literate but of questionable value. Currently with child. Minimum bid, 12 cents. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Some shook their heads. Others muttered about disease or disobedience. A few turned away, disinterested. Silas Guthrie, standing near the front, watched carefully. He was waiting for the mockery to die down, for the moment when no one else would bid. Then he'd raise his hand, make the transaction clean, and the matter would be done. Clara stood beside the platform, wrists bound in front of her. The thin fabric of her dress clung to her knees in the humidity. Her face was calm, not defiant, not broken, simply still. To the onlookers, that stillness seemed unnatural. To her, it was armor. Then, from the back of the crowd, a man spoke. 12 cents. The words sliced through the murmurs like a blade. Heads turned. The speaker was a stranger, tall, lean, coat travel-worn from the road. He looked too weathered to be a planter, too composed to be a laborer. He held himself like a man accustomed to danger. Pute hesitated, uncertain. "You are bidding 12 cents? "I am," the stranger said. "Name's Isaiah Mercer." Silas Guthrie's jaw tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was meant to be the only bidder, the only witness to Clara's transfer. The plan depended on silence and control. Now every second stretched into spectacle. Guthrie raised his hand. 13 cents. 25, Mercer replied instantly. 50. $1. The crowd's laughter turned into whispers. This was no longer routine, it was rebellion. A few men leaned forward, intrigued by the tension. Why would anyone pay a full dollar for a woman advertised as worthless? Guthrie's face flushed crimson. He could feel Duncan's gaze from the steps behind him. The master's eyes said one thing clearly. End this. $2, Guthrie said. 5, Mercer countered. The bids climbed 7, 9, 10. When Guthrie paused, Pute glanced toward Judge Crenshaw, who gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. $10 once. $10 twice, Pute declared, his voice cracking slightly. Sold to Mr. Isaiah Mercer. The gavel struck wood, a single, hollow sound that echoed down the courthouse corridor. For the first time, Clara lifted her eyes to the man who had bought her. Mercer didn't smile. He didn't touch her. He simply nodded to Pute, counted out the coins, $10 in silver, and pocketed the receipt. Duncan Fairholme stepped forward. Mr. Mercer, he said, voice sharp as glass, you are not from this parish. I am not, Mercer replied. Then what brings you here? Business. What kind? My own. The brief exchange carried the weight of challenge. Duncan's lips thinned. He could protest the sale, but that would expose its intent. The law, once invoked, could not be withdrawn without revealing his cruelty. No objection, he said finally, though I hope you find your purchase worth the price. Mercer's gaze didn't waver. I intend to. He led Clara away through the crowd, his pace brisk, his expression unreadable. Around them, whispers followed, questions about the stranger, about the price, about what kind of man spends $10 to own what another valued at 12 cents. No one realized they had just witnessed the beginning of the Fairholme family's unraveling, or that salvation, like sin, sometimes comes disguised as a sale. The wagon waited at the edge of town, its wooden wheels slick with rain. Isaiah Mercer guided Clara toward it without a word. His steps were calm, deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. To the watching eyes of Greensburg's townsfolk, he looked like any other trader finishing a day's business. Only Clara noticed the way he kept glancing behind them, scanning alleys and doorways, as if expecting pursuit. Once outside the square, he spoke. You don't remember me, he said quietly. Clara turned her head. Should I? Richmond, August, 1845. I was there the day you were sold. She stopped walking. You were one of them. I was, Mercer admitted, but not anymore. He climbed onto the wagon bench and extended his hand. She hesitated, then climbed up beside him. As the wheels began to turn, the courthouse and its crowd receded into the haze of dust behind them. I worked for a trader back then, Mercer continued. Ephraim Dalton. I kept his ledgers, drove his wagons. I thought I was just doing a job. Then I saw your family torn apart that morning. Your mother's scream followed me for years. Clara stared straight ahead, her jaw tightening. You remember my mother's scream, she said softly, but not her name. Mercer flinched. You're right. I never asked. That's what haunts me. From his coat, he withdrew a folded piece of paper and handed it to her. The parchment smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Inside was a deed of manumission, a legal document that, once signed and filed, would declare her free. Her name was written carefully at the top. Clara. Female. Age approximately 23. Literate. Beneath it, a blank space waited for Mercer's signature. What is this? She whispered. Freedom, he said. When properly executed. Clara shook her head. You expect me to believe a white man came to a courthouse in Louisiana to buy a slave and make her free? Mercer didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, guiding the horse through a curve that led them into the forested outskirts of the parish. A few months ago, he said, a man came to a meeting in Cincinnati. He told us about a woman who was pregnant, trapped on a plantation, marked for a cruel sale. His name was William Fairholme. Clara froze. William. He said he loved you, Mercer continued. He said his brother meant to destroy you. He asked if anyone could help. Her hand went instinctively to her stomach. William sent you? Mercer nodded. He paid me to buy you and take you north, to Illinois, then farther, wherever the law can't follow. Clara clutched the deed, disbelief and hope fighting inside her chest. Where is he now? Mercer's silence answered before his words did. He's gone. Fever, they said. But those who were with him don't believe it. He died in Kentucky, arranging routes for others. Some think Duncan had him found. The forest thickened around them, shadows stretching long and thin between the cypress trees. Clara's heart pounded with each turn of the wheels. So this is his plan, she said. You buy me, you free me, and I vanish. That's the idea. She looked at him again, studying his face. His eyes were tired, older than his years. There was sincerity in them, but also something else, something guarded. Why help me? She asked. What do you gain? Mercer hesitated, then said, Maybe I'm trying to balance a scale. I've spent too many years helping evil keep its books. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the creak of the wagon and the distant cries of riverbirds filled the silence. Ahead lay the winding roads of the deep south, miles of danger disguised as wilderness. Behind them, Duncan Fairholme was already realizing that his perfect plan had gone wrong. Clara looked down at the paper in her lap, the proof of a freedom that wasn't yet real. She didn't know whether to trust the man beside her or to fear him, but for the first time since the auction began, the air tasted like possibility. And possibility, in a world like hers, was the most fragile kind of hope. They traveled for hours, the courthouse shrinking behind them until even its bell tower disappeared into the swamp haze. The road north was little more than a rutted path carved through thickets of pine and oak. Water pooled in wool tracks, mirroring a sky that promised rain again before nightfall. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Clara studied the man beside her. Isaiah Mercer handled the reins with an ease that came from experience. But there was tension in his jaw, a carefulness that didn't belong to a man at peace. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked to the woods along the roadside. It wasn't the glance of a man fearing discovery. It was the watchfulness of someone expecting it. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. Where are we going? Mercer didn't look at her. North first, then west, he said. There's a family near Natchez who'll take us in. They'll have contacts to get us across the river. Across the river, she repeated. That's freedom. It's a start. His words were measured, deliberate, and yet something in them rang hollow. Clara turned her gaze to the forest ahead. Each tree looked like a sentinel guarding the road, its roots clutching the earth the way masters clutched their power. You've done this before, she said. Mercer nodded once, twice. Both times it worked. And both times for money? He hesitated. People need to eat, Miss Clara. Even good deeds have their price. Then this is business? It began that way, he admitted. It doesn't have to end that way. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of a church bell from some unseen town. Clara closed her eyes. The rhythm reminded her of the plantation bells at Bellamont. Signals for work, for meals, for obedience. Freedom was supposed to sound different, but it didn't. Mercer pointed to a narrow trail branching off the main road. We'll take that way, he said. Fewer patrols. Clara noticed how naturally he spoke of patrols, how easily he named the dangers. That kind of knowledge wasn't learned from books or conversations with abolitionists. It was learned from experience, from walking both sides of the line. Who are you really? She asked. His hands tightened on the reins. A man trying to fix what he helped build. The trail dipped into a ravine where shadows clung like cobwebs. The air grew damp and heavy, and the wagon creaked with each turn. When they stopped to rest near a stream, Clara stepped down, her legs stiff, her heart uneasy. Mercer busied himself with the horse, avoiding her eyes. Everything about their journey felt rehearsed. The timing, the direction, the explanations that came too easily. The world had taught Clara to read danger in small details. The pause before a lie, the certainty in a false promise. And something about Isaiah Mercer's calmness terrified her more than any whip ever could. As dusk bled across the horizon, Mercer lit a lantern and hung it from the wagon's frame. The glow flickered against his face, softening the hard lines of guilt etched there. "You should rest," he said. Clara climbed back into the wagon but didn't lie down. She kept her hand near the hem of her dress where Bethy's hidden knife waited, small but sharp, the only piece of control she possessed. For miles, the wheels turned steadily northward, the sound blending with the croak of frogs and the whisper of wind through trees. Each rotation carried her farther from Belmont, and yet closer to something she couldn't name. She wanted to believe in Mercer's promise, in William's faith, in the deed of manumission folded against her chest. But somewhere deep inside, another truth was taking root. Sometimes freedom wears the same face as captivity, and sometimes escape is just another kind of trap. Night fell like a curtain drawn across the forest. The wagon creaked to a stop in a small clearing surrounded by pine and cypress. Mercer unharnessed the horse, tethered it to a low branch, and built a small fire from damp wood that hissed as it burned. Clara sat across from him, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes fixed on the flames. The fire's light wavered across his face, carving shadows beneath his eyes and making him look older than he had in daylight. For the first time since the auction, he looked uncertain. The silence between them stretched long, broken only by the crackle of sap and the distant call of a whip-poor-will. Clara's mind raced. Every word he had spoken since the courthouse replayed itself, too smooth, too prepared. Finally, she spoke. "You've been here before." Mercer glanced up. "What makes you say that?" "You knew every turn of the road. You knew where the patrols ride. You didn't need a map." He poked at the fire with a stick, sparks scattering upward. "Knowing the roads keeps people alive." "Or caught," she said. The stick froze in his hand. "What are you saying?" Clara straightened her back. "I'm saying I don't believe this is a rescue. I think Duncan planned this. I think you're part of it." Mercer's eyes met hers across the fire. They were steady, unreadable. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he set the stick down and leaned forward. "You're right," he said quietly. "Partially." Clara's breath caught. Her hand went instinctively to the hem of her dress, fingers brushing the hidden knife. "Duncan knows about this route," Mercer continued. "He knows about me. He even knows what's supposed to happen tomorrow." "And what's that?" "He sent men to intercept us, 4 of them. They'll be waiting 20 miles north. They'll have papers from Judge Crenshaw voiding your sale. They'll call you fugitive property and drag you back to Belmont. That's the plan." "Then why tell me?" she demanded. "Because," he said, "I don't intend to follow it." Clara shook her head. "You expect me to believe that? I expect you to understand what's at stake." His voice was low, urgent. "If I refused Duncan's offer, he would have given the job to someone else. Someone crueler. Someone who'd make you suffer before they ever let you see freedom. This way, I can change the story before it ends." "Change it how?" Mercer reached into his saddlebag and tossed a small pouch across the fire. It landed beside her with a soft thud. $850. Enough to buy passage to Natchez, maybe a ship beyond. There's also a letter of introduction inside. A family of free blacks will hide you until you can move on. Clara stared at the pouch, then back at him. "And what happens when Duncan's men find us?" "They won't find you," Mercer said. "They'll find someone else." He explained the plan in a slow, deliberate voice. At dawn, they'd reach a settlement south of the road, a small place mostly invisible on maps. There lived a woman named Ruth Chambers, dying of consumption, willing to trade her last days for money to feed her children. She would take Clara's place in the wagon. When Duncan's men arrived, they would capture Ruth instead. By the time they realized the mistake, Clara would be far away. Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. "You'd let a dying woman take my place?" "She chose it," Mercer said. "And she has her reasons. I'm giving you a chance she never had." For a long time, Clara said nothing. The knife in her lap gleamed faintly in the firelight, a reminder of the choice Bethy had given her, to die on her own terms if hope turned to deception. But now another possibility had appeared, thin, dangerous, fragile. "You really think this will work?" she whispered. Mercer looked into the fire. It has to, he said. Because tomorrow, mercy is the only lie worth telling. Dawn came slow and gray, the forest still slick with dew. Mercer extinguished the fire, his movements quiet and practiced. Clara hadn't slept. The knife still lay near her hand, though she hadn't touched it since their conversation. She watched him prepare the wagon with a mixture of distrust and reluctant faith. Trust, she realized, was a currency she had been forced to spend too often. By the time the first thin ribbon of sunlight filtered through the trees, they were back on the road. The world around them was waking. Birds calling, insects humming, the ordinary life of nature indifferent to the choices that would decide hers. After 2 hours of silence, Mercer spoke. "We'll reach the settlement before midday." "What happens when we get there?" she asked. "You'll meet her," he said simply. The trail opened into a clearing dotted with small cabins built from rough-cut pine. Chickens wandered freely between the houses. Smoke curled from 1 or 2 chimneys, carrying the faint scent of cornbread and soap ash. Life here looked fragile but peaceful, the kind of peace that exists only when the world forgets you. "This place isn't on any map," Mercer said. "That's how they've survived." He led Clara to the smallest cabin, its porch sagging under the weight of years. A young boy, barefoot and wary, watched them from behind the doorway. Mercer knelt and pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Tell your aunt we're here," he whispered. A few minutes later, a woman appeared, thin, coughing into a rag she tried to hide. Her skin carried the pale gray hue of someone already walking the border between life and death. Yet her eyes, when she looked at Clara, were clear, steady, and alive. "This is Ruth Chambers," Mercer said softly. Ruth studied Clara for a long moment before nodding. "You're the one," she said. Her voice was rough, nearly a whisper. "The one worth saving." Clara shook her head. "I don't know about worth." Ruth gave a small smile. "None of us do. But sometimes we get to decide who lives to find out." She gestured for Clara to come inside. The cabin smelled of sage and damp wood. A single window let in a weak beam of light that fell across a neatly made bed. A Bible rested open on the table beside it, its pages marked by a child's drawing pressed flat inside. 3 small figures held hands beneath a sun made of charcoal circles. "My children," Ruth said, following Clara's gaze. "They'll stay here. The money Mr. Mercer promised will feed them through the winter. Maybe longer." Clara's throat tightened. "And you?" "I'm dying," Ruth said matter-of-factly. "Consumption. The doctor says weeks, maybe less. I'd rather those weeks mean something." Mercer stepped forward, voice low. "I explained the plan. Tomorrow, Duncan's men will stop us on the North Road. Ruth will be in the wagon wearing your shawl. They'll think she's you. She'll end it before they can question her." Clara turned sharply. "End it?" Ruth met her eyes. "There's medicine," she said quietly. "Enough to make it quick. My death will be my own choice, not theirs." The words struck Clara like a blow. She wanted to protest, to refuse the gift being forced on her. But Ruth's calm made argument impossible. "Why do this?" Clara asked, voice breaking. Ruth reached for her hand. Her fingers were thin, bones sharp beneath skin. "Because I want my children to remember that their mother did one thing the world couldn't take from her." She decided how her story ends. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot and useless. "I'll tell your children about you," she promised. "They'll know your name." "Good," Ruth whispered. "Names matter. Even when the world forgets them, God doesn't." The 2 women sat in silence, holding hands as light shifted across the cabin floor. Outside, Mercer busied himself checking the wagon's harness, his face unreadable. He'd watched men die before, but this was different. This was consent disguised as courage, a sacrifice made in place of a prayer. When it was time to leave, Ruth pressed the shawl and bonnet into Clara's arms. "These will fool them for a while," she said. "Don't waste what I'm giving you. Run until the world can't find you." Clara hesitated in the doorway, sunlight catching the tears she refused to wipe away. "You're a brave woman, Ruth Chambers." Ruth smiled faintly. "No," she said. "I'm just finished being afraid." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees like a sigh. Clara walked toward the waiting road, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, Ruth lay down on the bed, the small bottle of medicine within reach. By the next sunrise, one woman would be free, and the other would be gone. Her courage carried forward in a name whispered by a stranger who promised not to forget. By dawn the next morning, the wagon rolled north again, cloaked in mist so dense it softened every sound. The road ahead looked endless, a narrow ribbon of mud that disappeared into the horizon. Ruth Chambers, wrapped in Clara's shawl and bonnet, sat quietly in the back, her breath shallow but even. Beside her lay a small satchel containing the bottle of laudanum she would use when the time came. Isaiah Mercer drove in silence. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were restless, darting toward the tree line with every crack of twig or rustle of leaves. Somewhere behind them, the world was already shifting. Duncan Fairholme's men were riding hard, convinced that order and property must be restored. 2 hours passed before they appeared. For horsemen, dark coats gleaming with rain, pistols at their belts. They blocked the narrow road where it dipped between two ridges. The lead rider, a scar-faced man with a judge's warrant pinned to his coat, raised his hand. "Hold there." Mercer's pulse quickened. He reined the horse to a stop and turned toward Ruth. She met his gaze without fear. Her lips moved silently now. He climbed down slowly as the riders approached. "Is there trouble, gentlemen?" The leader swung from his saddle. "We're looking for stolen property. Female, Negro, 23 years of age. Sold last week in St. Helena Parish under false pretenses." Mercer forced a tired smile. "You'll find no one of that description here." The man's eyes slid to the wagon. "Step aside." Mercer hesitated just long enough to make it convincing, then stepped back. The second rider pulled the tarp aside. Beneath it, Ruth lifted her head. The shawl shadowed her face. Her skin, pale from sickness, carried the faint sheen of sweat. "That's her," one of them muttered. "The Fairholme girl." The leader nodded. "You there, step down." Ruth obeyed slowly, her movements heavy with the weariness of both illness and decision. She coughed once, the sound rattling like dry leaves. Mercer watched as she touched the edge of her shawl, then looked back at him for the briefest moment. In that look was everything unspoken: gratitude, resolve, farewell. She turned to the riders. "I am who you're looking for," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You can take me back." The leader frowned. "No fight? No denial? No more running," Ruth said. "Just let me rest." They didn't notice the small bottle in her hand, half hidden beneath the folds of fabric. She uncorked it as one of them bound her wrists. Mercer felt the world slow, the air thick, sound fading to a single heartbeat. Ruth tilted her head back and swallowed. Within moments, her knees buckled. The riders cursed, trying to catch her, but she was already sinking, her breath escaping in a soft sigh. Her body slumped against the wagon wheel, eyes half open, a faint smile frozen on her lips. The men panicked. "What's happening?" one shouted. Mercer knelt beside her, placing a hand over her pulse. "She's gone," he said. His voice cracked, but he didn't let it tremble. "You wanted your property. There it lies." The leader stared at the lifeless body, unsure whether to feel anger or fear. The law had no language for sacrifice. "We'll take her back," he muttered finally. Mercer nodded. "As you wish." He watched as they lifted Ruth's body onto a horse and rode away, leaving him alone on the road, the echo of hooves fading into fog. Only when the last sound disappeared did he turn back toward the trees. From the shadows, Clara emerged, her dress dirt-stained, her hair covered with a kerchief. She had watched everything. Her face was streaked with tears that refused to fall. "She did it," Clara whispered. Mercer nodded. "She chose it." Clara's hand covered her heart. "Then we owe her our lives." They stood in silence, the morning mist curling around them like smoke. Somewhere far ahead, the river waited, the final barrier between bondage and something like freedom. Behind them, Ruth Chambers' sacrifice became the legend no court record could erase. A dying woman who traded her last breath for another's beginning, proving that even in a world ruled by cruelty, mercy could still wear a mortal face. For 3 days, Clara and Mercer traveled without stopping except to water the horse. The world around them blurred into a wash of trees and sky, the road dissolving beneath the wheels like time itself. The air grew cooler as they moved north, the heavy humidity of the Louisiana lowlands giving way to a wind that smelled faintly of pine and freedom. Yet the silence between them grew heavier with every mile. Neither spoke of Ruth Chambers. Her name lingered unspoken, too sacred for casual words. At night, when Mercer built small fires to keep away the cold, Clara would watch the flames flicker and think of the woman's calm eyes, her steady voice, her final smile. Ruth's death was not an ending. It was a debt, and debts, Clara knew, must someday be repaid. On the 4th day, they reached the banks of the Mississippi River. The water was wide and fast, swollen from spring rains. A ferry waited at a makeshift dock, manned by a quiet freedman named Jacob who took one look at Clara, then at Mercer and said nothing. He only nodded once and motioned them aboard. Halfway across the river, the wind changed. The scent of the southern soil faded behind them, replaced by the cool breath of open country. Mercer exhaled slowly, as if releasing a lifetime of ghosts. "Once we cross," he said, "there's no turning back." Clara's eyes stayed on the horizon. "I have nothing left to turn back to." When they reached the far bank, Jacob handed her a folded piece of parchment. "A gift," he said. Inside was a single line written in neat, careful script. "Keep your name safe. It's the only thing they can't buy or bury." That night, as they camped near the edge of a dense forest, Mercer finally told her everything. Duncan Fairholme had indeed sent men to intercept them. But when word of Ruth's death reached him, he collapsed in a fit of rage and disbelief. Within weeks, his fields began to wither, his debts multiplied, and Bellamont became a cursed name whispered only in regret. Judge Crenshaw continued his work until a stroke silenced his gavel for good. Nathaniel Pute's records vanished mysteriously from the courthouse archives, as if someone had purged the evidence of their shared guilt. "What about you?" Clara asked quietly. Mercer stared into the dark. "I'll vanish too. Men like me don't deserve to be remembered." "You bought me my life," she said. He shook his head. "No, you earned it long before I ever came." By summer, Clara had made it to Illinois, then farther still, northward into territories where her skin no longer made her a crime. She found work as a seamstress, then as a teacher, passing on the secret her mother had once given her. Letters, words, the freedom of the mind. Her child, a girl she named Ruth, was born under an open sky in 1854. Years later, when the war came and freedom arrived not as mercy but as policy, Clara's name never appeared on any register. She preferred it that way. Some stories, she knew, survived best in whispers. Decades passed before the truth resurfaced. In 1897, during the courthouse renovations in St. Helena Parish, workers discovered the sealed wall containing the original bill of sale, the same document that had marked her as property. On its back, in faded ink, was a single sentence written in an unfamiliar hand. She was never ours to own. No one could identify the handwriting. Some said it was William Fairholme's, written before his death. Others believed it belonged to Isaiah Mercer himself. The record was locked away again, this time under the pretense of preservation. But copies circulated quietly among historians who recognized the power of those 6 words. What remained was not just a story of cruelty. It was a record of resistance written between the lines of legality. And though history forgot Clara's last name, it remembered the 12 cents, the receipt, and the truth the law tried to hide. That even the smallest act of defiance can echo louder than the silence built to contain it. History remembers numbers better than names. 12 cents. 1 receipt. 2 signatures. A woman erased. But behind those numbers were hearts that bled, hands that trembled, and a world that called obedience a virtue. Clara's story, like so many others, wasn't written to comfort us. It was written to confront us. The greatest cruelty of her time wasn't just the whip or the chain. It was the law that blessed them. It was men who convinced themselves that justice could exist without humanity. And when the law becomes the instrument of oppression, mercy itself becomes rebellion. Ruth Chambers understood that. She didn't die to be remembered. She died so another could live to remember her. And Isaiah Mercer, flawed, haunted, guilty, proved that even the condemned can choose redemption. Together, they tore a hole in the fabric of a system built on silence. Through that tear, truth escaped. The woman who was sold for 12 cents carried generations in her womb, her courage hidden in the bloodline of freedom. Her child, born under open sky, became the living proof that dignity doesn't die, it transforms. Every act of remembrance, every retelling, every whisper of her name is another strike against the walls built by history's liars. So when you hear this story, don't just grieve it, listen to it. Ask yourself, what injustices do we still bless with silence? What walls still hide the receipts of human suffering? If voices like Clara's and Ruth's move you, don't let them vanish again. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows, where truth is exhumed one forgotten life at a time. And tell me in the comments, what story from your land, your family, your history still waits to be unearthed? Because remembering isn't enough. We must refuse to forget.